This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a historian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in Jewish American history and the history of American socialism, the meeting point of which is exactly what we're here to discuss: the attitudes of American Marxists towards Zionism during the Second World War and in its immediate aftermath. Dr. Tony Michels, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
So by way of introduction, can you please tell us what was the state of American Marxism in the 1940s? Map it out for us.
So the 1940s was a time of contrasts. On the one hand, the American Communist Party, which was the largest party on the political left, had reached its peak membership, in part because it had gained a lot of momentum during the Great Depression, but also because of World War II. The U.S. alliance with the Soviet Union added prestige to the Communist Party. So it was a significant movement. The membership was maybe around 90,000, but it had many sympathizers and activists on the periphery of the party in various front groups, among intellectuals and so forth. That was the main party on the left, but there were smaller parties. There was the Socialist Party, and there were small Trotskyist parties that didn't have a huge number of members, but a lot of prominent intellectuals.
And the Trotskyites in America, as elsewhere, hated the communists more than the bourgeois.
Well, I wouldn't say more, but at least equally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so was it really a force to be reckoned with politically in America at the time, as it was in Europe, or was it still different?
The Trotskyists were not a force to be reckoned with politically in any way, shape, or form. They were a force to be reckoned with in certain trade unions, such as the Teamsters Union in Minneapolis, believe it or not, and in intellectual circles, most importantly.
Can you tell us a bit about the main players and name names?
Sure. So in the 1930s and 40s, you have names that are associated with the New York intellectuals in the journal Partisan Review, who were either Trotskyists or close to Trotskyism and sympathetic to it. And depending on what year we're talking about, it would include the art and literary critic Harold Rosenberg, the future literary critic Irving Howe, who was just in the 1940s making a name for himself as an essayist and cultural critic. Someone who was not a Trotskyist but moved in those circles was Nathan Glazer. He was a left-wing Zionist in the 30s, but was close to the Trotskyists, and later became a very prominent sociologist.
So we're talking here also, this is a universal phenomenon of communists being predominantly Jewish.
So in the 40s, the Communist Party had a very large Jewish membership in New York, which was the home to the largest number of communists. The majority of communists in the New York area were Jews. So in New York, yes, the majority of communists were Jews.
And among the Trotskyite intellectuals?
No one's done an official count, but it seems that, again, in New York, the majority of Trotskyists, maybe the vast majority, were Jews.
That begs the question, what was their attitude towards Zionism and the national liberation of the Jewish people? Because, communists around the world, and here I'm lumping together a few movements, and do forgive me for doing that, saw, even in Palestine at the time, the British ruled Palestine, saw Zionism as this imperialist, bourgeois, reactionary movement. Was this shared also by American Marxists?
Yes and no. Going into the 1930s, let's say, I can even be more specific. Prior to 1929, most American socialists didn't think about Zionism or Palestine much at all. The riots in Palestine in 1929 changed that. The Communist Party of the United States began denouncing Zionism and described the Arab uprising as an anti-imperialist uprising, which cost the Communist Party dearly in the Jewish community.
Would you say that the Jewish community had sympathies for Zionism already back in the 1930s?
The 1920s saw a move towards greater sympathy with Zionism, in certainly in the immigrant Jewish community. I don't mean to say immigrant Jews were becoming Zionists, but they were becoming more sympathetic to it and engaged with it. So 1929, though, marks the first time that a group on the left organized an anti-Zionist campaign. That had never happened before 1929. Right. In the 30s, so that, if you mark that year, is a year in which the non-Yiddish speaking American left took an interest in Palestine.
Right.
Right. That was a turning point year then. Throughout the 30s, most Marxists would say Zionism is a reactionary imperialist movement and not give it a whole lot of thought beyond that. Marxists began paying attention to Zionism with greater attention in the late 30s, during the Great Revolt between 1936 and 1939. The Great Arab Revolt attracted more attention. Then in the 40s, things begin to change. Again, in the 30s, Marxists would say they're anti-Zionist almost across the board. You might be able to find individuals who didn't agree with that, but again, they didn't think about it a whole lot. Things begin to change for a couple of reasons in the 40s. The first change was because during World War II, the Soviet Union sought to mobilize American Jewish public support for the Red Army. And the Communist Party was the instrument to do that. So as part of the strategy of mobilizing support for the Red Army and the Communist Party began to soften its hostility to Zionism.
Why did Zionism even play a role in this? Because
by the early 1940s, many of the major Jewish organizations were pro-Zionist, such as I'm talking about the American Jewish Congress, Hadassah, a number of important newspapers, conservative Judaism, the branch of Judaism known as conservative Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, or modern Orthodox Judaism. There was a consensus already building behind Zionism in the attitude, and the Communist Party was that if we hope to lead what it called a Jewish people's movement in support of the Soviet Union, they would have to soften their opposition. So that's evident already by 1942-43. And then if you move a few years later, the Soviet Union backs the creation of the State of Israel, and therefore the American Communist Party does the same thing. So that's without ever endorsing Zionism, it supports the creation of the State of Israel. So the Communist Party moves in that direction. Trotskyists are on a different trajectory because they're independent of Moscow. If you ask a Trotskyist in 1944-45 their thoughts about Zionism, they're completely against it. If you ask them again in 1946, things are beginning to change radically.
Because of the plight of the Jews in Europe.
Exactly.
So they realize that there must be a solution, and Zionism may well be one of them.
Yes, that's basically it, but they wrestle with an agonizing process of reassessment. So in 46, they're not prepared to say Zionism is a solution, because that is an endorsement of Zionism as an ideology. It's a process that the ideological rethinking is so subtle, it will appear tortured and maybe even ridiculous to people on the outside. But if you understand the inner thought processes of the Trotskyist movement, you can see profound changes in their thinking. So that in 1946, for instance, you can read a Trotskyist newspaper called Labor Action and see editorials, letters to the editor, articles saying Zionism is an imperialist movement, we're against it. However, the plight of European Jewry is so desperate that the British must open the doors to Palestine to any Jew who wants to move there. For instance, that's a significant
Did
change.
they try and apply pressure? Well, that might be the wrong word because it was so politically ineffectual. But call for America to open the doors for...
Yes, that too. The position of this particular newspaper, which is connected to a small party called the Workers' Party, the view was that the U.S., Palestine, and any country that Jews want to move to should be open to them.
Well, what about Trotsky himself? He was assassinated famously by Stalin's agents in Mexico in 1940. What was his position on the Jewish question?
I don't think you could say he had a position by the time he had been assassinated in 1940. What he had begun to do in the course of the 1930s is develop some thoughts that he expressed on occasion over the course of the decade through interviews, mainly in the Jewish press. And
interviews he gave to the Jewish press.
Interviews he gave to the Jewish press throughout the 1930s. and what comes out is nothing coherent, resembling a well-thought-through position, which he acknowledged. He never claimed to have developed.
Which is strange because he himself was Jewish.
Yes.
I mean, we should not forget that. And so he never reflected on his Judaism, at least not in these terms.
He did slightly. So there's one interview he gave in the earlier mid-30s where he said, I wish I had learned Yiddish because it has now developed such a robust literature in that language, it's worth reading it. Mm-hmm. But he came from a Russian-speaking home, and he never really knew the language. But that acknowledgement that the language had developed this well-developed culture by the 1930s, and he wished he could take part in its, at least as a consumer of literature, that represented a change in his thinking. He was no longer of the attitude completely that I'm not a Jew, as he once put it or said to have put it. I am a social democrat. I'm not a Russian. I'm not a Jew. I'm a social democrat. That changes a little bit.
Right.
He begins commenting on anti-Semitism in some very perceptive ways. He predicted in 1938 or 39 in an interview that if a war broke out in Europe, he said the Jews would be annihilated. He was convinced that that's what would happen.
Wow. Yeah, so he and Jabotinsky were the only ones who actually...
Now, Trotsky's, the difference between Trotsky and Jabotinsky is Trotsky's view is the only thing that could save Jews is revolution.
Yeah.
Now, within that view, he did acknowledge the possibility of two things. One is that the Jewish people, and he used the term, the Jewish people would survive for the long term. That's a shift in his thinking, that they weren't about to assimilate. That was the old view.
Yeah.
The new view of Trotsky and some of his followers was that they were going to exist as a people, that anti-Semitism was much worse than they realized or appreciated. And Trotsky went so far as to say, in a future socialist order, a territorial homeland for Jews is possible, but it could only happen in a socialist order. So he said, Zionism is ridiculous. Zionism couldn't possibly save Jews in a world consumed by fascism, capitalism, anti-Semitism.
So all this was the reason that it took the Trotskyites in the 1940s these growing pains of developing a new position on Zionism, because they did what no communist does or no socialist does, and that is break away from the canon of the great thinkers.
That's right. They weren't prepared to do that until 46. Yeah, it was really the impact of the Holocaust that caused this.
And did the creation of the State of Israel change any of that? We know that the Communist Party supported the creation of a Jewish state because Stalin did. What was the Trotskyites' position on the partition plan?
So there were two main Trotskyist parties. The one I've been discussing is the Workers' Party. This is, again, the party that Irving Howe, one of its most famous members, belonged to. At the moment Israel was created, the Workers' Party's position was that Israel is a fact. It's not a desirable end goal, but it exists. It must be defended. It must be armed. But we hope it won't continue to exist as a Jewish nation state. The ultimate ideal goal that had no, of course, basis in reality, but which they understood, but the ideal goal is that there would be a future socialist Middle East in which Jews and Arabs would share national rights of some kind. Over time, this group disbanded. Its members went in different directions. But the legacy of this thinking, which you could call post-anti-Zionism, people who still hadn't embraced Zionism as an ideology but had become sympathetic to the project of securing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, that way of thinking persisted mainly or most prominently in the magazine Dissent, edited, again, by Irving Howe. Dissent became the foremost intellectual journal of the democratic socialist left. Still exists. But that's where you'd find this perspective.
It's no longer the bastion of the intellectual left, is it?
No, it's not. Not quite that. But it exists, and it's still vibrant, and there's a new generation of young people who are reading it. Sometimes they find it not radical enough, but nonetheless, it's still very much part of the scene. But for a number of decades, you could see this perspective that has its roots in the rethinking among certain Trotskyists in the 40s coming into fruition as an outlook on Israel. And it becomes very strong in the magazine in the 1960s, 70s, and beyond. In the 50s, it slowly percolates as a certain kind of perspective. It's not a line. It's not a hardened position. It's just a way of looking at Israel in the Middle East that was informed by what happened in the 1940s. That's one Trotskyist group. The other the Socialist Workers' Party, which persists to this day, adhered to an anti-Zionist position throughout.
What is it called?
The Socialist Workers' Party. This was the original Trotskyist party in America, and it's hewed to an anti-Zionist line throughout. Now the grassroots membership may not have agreed with the leadership, because I looked through party bulletins and I looked through letters to the editor, and it's clear many readers are coming out in support of the State of Israel. So it's hard to exactly know what the balance of forces in that party were. What is clear is that even in that party, which again was officially anti-Zionist, had a pro-Israel perspective within it. Ultimately, those people seem to have left.
Yeah.
The party moves in different directions, and by the 1960s, when it's revived in the late 60s, infused by young new leftists, young college radicals, the party serves to transmit the older, pre-formulated anti-Zionist position to a new generation. So these different Trotskyists leave different legacies.
That's really very interesting, but I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. Dr. Tony Michels, a historian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a specialist of Jewish American history and the history of American socialism. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
אנחנו כבר ביחד 2 ו3 הרבה יותר ממה שמישהו נתן לנו גם היא, גם אני לא באמת האמנו וזה התחיל כמו עוד סיפור אבל היה שם משהו שעבר רגש שחשבתי שאיבדתי